Welcome back to another episode of 5 in 15. This is most likely the last episode of season 1, so thanks everybody for being here. I'm Ben, and today I brought yet another co-host. Variety is the salt of life, or the spice, or whatever it is. It is a condiment, I think. So, with that being said, over to the salt, the condiment for today. Geoffrey.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm Geoffrey, a PhD student looking at how humour spreads across different social media platforms.
Right, and we've got our guest here for today. And we might just throw it back to the guest here now with the first question. So, guest, can you please introduce yourself and how you're broadly working with humour? The first 5 questions, 15 minutes. The premise should be clear by now. Hopefully starts. Mark, over to you.
The guest comes from behind a screen and announces himself as Mark Rolfe.
It is very game show-like, I think.
It is, isn't it? And I'm attached to the University of New South Wales. And my interests, academic interests, are Australian and American politics, with a focus on satire, of course, and populism and leadership and propaganda. So those topics weave through my work now, and I have done comparisons of Australian and American satire. But most of all at the moment, I've
the T word.
The T word, the convicted T word as of today.
As 34 times convicted T word.
Yes. The big, I don't want to say T-Rex, that gives him too much. T-Trump. T-Trump. So I've worked on a book on Trump and satire, and also those who support him and are against him in satire, leading satirists of America, and how satire can be used by either side in connection to political identity. And in many respects, this is from a satire from a rhetorical point of view, really. So it follows in the manner of much scholarly analysis that happens now, which takes what's called a discursive approach. I come from the background in satire, in rhetoric, and with contextual and intellectual history with this stuff. So in that respect, I really weave together politics, history, and humour.
Sorry, I was just going to say you weave it all together, and we come back to that specific point later, but maybe just quickly to follow on from there.
Yeah.
How do you weave it together in this, with a capital T Trump context? Just really quickly if you can.
By going to the history of American rhetoric and taking it back through time, particularly the tropes of heroes and monsters and gods, which you can track back to the likes of George Washington, or more specifically to those who commended him, especially after his death. He was the god. He was Zeus in statue form, as still exists today. So that's set a tradition. And where you've got heroes in any good Marvel universe, you've also got monsters as well.
Right, yeah.
So this follows on from some particular American traits, which, in terms of what is often called providentialism, the belief that God has a plan for the United States, may be a bit difficult to discern today, given the conviction of Trump. Nevertheless.
All right, maybe on that cliffhanger, we just let the audience, hang just a tiny bit and come back in a moment. But we've got the next question, Geoffrey. If you
Yeah. So, Mark, how has your field and the understanding of humour research changed over time?
The field has only been established since the 1970s. So it's a relatively new academic field. But until recently, it has been dominated by psychology and the prerequisites of psychology. So it posited universal traits, humour as a universal trait, universal human trait, sense of humour as a universal human trait. Now, that idea lacked intellectual history and context. And you found a lot of the time there were brief references in some works in the past to humour theory from ancient and medieval times. And it was all to do with medicine, really, and the body and the temperament and the 4 liquids that were supposed to infuse the body. Nothing to do with jests, nothing to do with laughter, nothing to do with what we know as humour. So you've got a concept that we're using now that has a history that's varied, and yet a lot of scholars weren't really taking that into account, and then positing that, oh, well, we're all human, we all laugh, we all have a sense of humour. It's always been that way. And particularly in the last 10, 15 years, you've seen this movement from various parts of the scholarly world to say, hang on, there's a history to these things, and to move into the discursive approach that I discussed before. So in many respects, my work on rhetoric and American politics fitted right in with that.
Right. And as you can see, we're already making big, massive I guess jumps, across certain fields and knowledge traditions here, from Trump to liquids and whatnot. So, it's massively interesting there.
Nothing if not flexible.
Nothing is, which humour is,
yes.
I think, just this constant flexibility as a researcher, again, which we'll come back to in a moment. So with that, let's move to the next question, Mark. So what suggestions would you give early career colleagues just starting out and, trying to build a career working with humour studies? What would you tell them?
I've always been interested in politics, history and humour since before I went to university. And I didn't start off with humour, studying humour. With my honours thesis, it was Americanization of Australia. And so was my PhD. And so I've always been interested in that sort of interaction of Australia and America. So in other words, I've been able to slot humour into that. I've had different strings to my bow, and I think that's advisable for any early career researcher.
So you didn't start out and say this is exactly the direction and I want to go
right.
in. So
Yeah, I moved.
Right.
Yes, and I think it's important for the researcher, because you've got to be flexible in your universities these days across several fields, as you both well know. But it's also useful for your humour research. To go back to what I said before, I think humour has to be put in context. You have to know the context, in other words. So for when you're dealing with satire, American satire, you have to put that into the American context of politics and history.
You need to know what the Trump thing is all about, otherwise it's just in a vacuum and makes no sense.
Yes. And is Trump a novel phenomenon, or is he a recurrence of American history, American redux, in other words, of some things from the past?
I mean, in that context, again, because you touched on so many different things before, it just shows that, I guess, just if I can paraphrase, there with humour, it really is a very complex thing. And so you need to be kind of versed in lots of different almost career traditions, like history, epistemology, all these things.
And not just the one field like psychology, as in the past.
Right.
This is not to disparage psychology as a discipline.
Now is the time to do it.
Or some of our colleagues who may be listening.
Ooh, yes. Maybe, Geoffrey, we move on.
Yeah.
But it is to say, the constricted approach of some previous generations of scholars has not done the field well.
Who shall not be named?
Yeah.
Who shall not be named? The Voldemorts of humour studies.
Yes. Instead, we'll turn to something a bit more encouraging. What reasons would you give? Why would you study humour?
Because it's part of our culture, like art, politics, sociology, music. It's all part. They're all part of contemporary society and culture, whatever society you're in. We all indulge humour to a greater or lesser extent. Some just amateurs day to day, some professionals on the nightly TV or whatever. So I think in that respect, it gets back to this issue of society and context. Why not study humour if it's part of our living and our culture?
Yeah.
And why not understand it when it's too often ignored by a lot of academics? And here I'm going outside the field of scholarly humour studies to say that a lot of academia doesn't take humour seriously. And they need to, especially when you've got so many politicians, so many advertising agencies, so many corporations allied with those advertising agencies, so many media corporations, all investing in humour at one time or another, in one way or another. And you see people from across those fields and others dipping in and out of humour. Humour is not separate, in other words. We categorise it in academia as sort of a separate study, but people don't treat humour that way in their day-to-day lives. So in that respect, it's looking more across the rainbow of human life. How's that?
Yeah.
Humour is another colour in that spectrum.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Right. And I mean, it is that artificial separation where, you go to people and say, so why? What are you afraid of? Who hurt you? So why are you so scared of looking into humor as a part of your life? And why? I think, we had a full disclosure, Mark and I, we just published a book together. And we had lots of conversations about that specific topic. Geoffrey, you have a lifetime ahead of you with that.
Oh, goodness, yeah. Looking forward to it.
Justifying being the Swiss Army knife of academia. But, it's...
Yeah, in many respects, our area of study is a victim of the way universities were set up in the 19th century. The legacy of dividing up into certain fields, okay, we've come some way from that, but there's still the logic of that division and that box ticking and categories and all that sort of stuff. And that has impeded, I think, being more flexible.
And I think, it kind of really couldn't be a better segue into the last question we have for you today, Mark, which is...
What does the future portend for humour? Where do you see it going?
It's no surprise, given our age of populism, and to talk of that certain orange-coifed man in the United States who is a leading populist. And this is obviously a difficulty for politics and society these days, in which the outsider fighting against the establishment is seen as so important and heroic. One may not believe that Trump is a hero, but a lot of people do think he's a hero. He falls into the populist paradigm. Now, humour has fitted very neatly into the requirements of the digital and populist age we live in. And it's become a very valuable tool or weapon, whatever you want to call it, in these populist games. Now, that leads to issues of people being rebels and breaking social boundaries. And everybody loves a rebel who breaks social boundaries, steps over them all the time, and hence you get all these supposedly rebellious middle-aged white men talking about how they're fighting wokeness and they're being cancelled and nobody is listening to them on their Netflix special. Okay, so this is how...
Mark's saying it as it is.
You can't do comedy now because of woke.
As an official old fart, I can rain on the parade of these other old farts. And what you have is this glorification of transgression. So the future portends, I think at this stage, more of this idea of transgression of social boundaries as humour. I don't think it's necessarily humorous, but we're seeing the idea riding on the coattails of humour and populism and all sorts of people. Google Michael Malice. He's an American far-right guy. And they ride the coattails of this sort of stuff. And they get great followings. A lot of people, Russell Brand's another one, who's riding this idea of transgression, and he's supposed to be a stand-up comedian, but he's not my sort. But this is what I mean. So we're going to see more of that in the future in a variety of ways, both political and I think to some extent in other areas as well, where we see humour being used quite frequently to get attention in a world that has a tsunami of information sweeping over it and trying to get your attention that way. So humour and transgression in various combinations
And in the online space, it's just the
Yes.
perfect blend of like fuel and attention or kind of flaring that, like
Yes.
flagging that works like nothing else.
Now, it's going to be interesting to see whether people eventually get tired of that phase as well. And something else has to come along
Right.
in this swamped world to get eyeballs, as they say.
That's what we've got Geoffrey for, working on stuff like that in the future. So, Geoffrey, you've got your work cut out for you there.
Yeah, I'm going to be dealing with a lot of bad jokes and harassment probably.
Yes, yeah.
That's it. Time. Mark, you couldn't be more on time, I dare say.
That went very quickly, as you said.
Yeah, perfectly fine to do that on the 15-minute mark. That's it for today, I think. Thanks so much, Geoffrey. Thanks so much, Mark.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Mark,
Thank you, Landsman. Thank you, Bull Boys.
That's your final word?
That is.
All right.
No,
awesome.
that is.
That is.
No, that is.
Okay. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.